I'm not entirely convinced that the item on the agenda is actually what we want to be discussing. Given that KubeCon is next week, it would seem more productive to focus on what work items we want to complete and make sure that we're coordinating towards their getting done. I know people are working on demos, presentations, that sort of stuff, and working on things that are beyond KubeCon at this point. I'm not sure how useful that is. But what other people think? Is there a substantive reason to be considering a major change to the user experience that won't be reflected for KubeCon, most likely?
Yeah, I think that's valid. Actually, we put up this thing because there was no other discussion items in the meeting. So if you want to postpone it, I think it should be fine to maintain the whatever APIs currently we have. We can postpone this discussion. Yep.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. I think I might have asked for that discussion at some point. Sorry, I missed the last meeting that I think was supposed to happen then.
No, I don't think we had it last meeting. So we could maybe just discuss an administrative detail while we wait for Irfan. So KubeCon's next week, so presumably meeting is canceled, yes? And then often post KubeCon, a meeting is canceled because people have to travel or they're tired or they're catching up or whatever. I mean, that's the general convention. I'm not suggesting we have to follow it. And then we have pre-Christmas and Christmas, which for North Americans is maybe a fraught time. But that said, I mean, presumably we want to meet. My suggestion would be like deciding for the month of December what dates we actually would commit to meeting. What do people think?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the only realistic date, especially I think we need to.
Yeah.
I think the only realistic date, as far as I can tell, is the week after KubeCon. For those people who will be around. So I would suggest we have one same normal time week after next. I think that'll be the only time we get together in December again.
Okay, I think that's fine. So maybe we could set the agenda now, just so that we're not in danger of missing it. The idea is that we want to have an agenda before we schedule a meeting, and presumably, like an obvious point of coordination is, hey, what happened to KubeCon?
Yeah, there's another item. So the Upbound guys who released that crossplane project yesterday that you posted, Maru, they're quite keen to talk to us and tell us about what they've done, and also find out what we're doing, and etc. Do a general Q&A. So we can do that in the Federation meeting because it's basically Federation, or we can do it in the multi-cluster meeting. I don't really feel too strongly either way.
I think I would lean towards Federation.
Yeah, it's more focused.
Yeah,
we can post just an FYI to the other group, which doesn't seem very active anyway. I'm not sure how many attendees we get there. We seem to get more here.
So I've added 2 items to the agenda: what happened at KubeCon and crossplane Q&A. What happened at KubeCon can just be organic, but for the crossplane one, Quentin, if you're in contact with them, do you want to invite them?
Yes, I have invited them already.
Okay, great.
They reached out to me, and I told them I'd put them on the agenda. They almost made it today, but they're all exhausted after their big launch yesterday, so they're having a long sleep. Yeah, I guess the other item is the one we have on the current agenda, which I think we decided to talk about. Whether to, I think it was your proposal, Maru, if I recall correctly, to essentially go back to a more unified API. And I had I think there are pros and cons to it. I had some reservations about it, and I think the idea was that we wanted to talk about all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think I'm more on the pro side, but I definitely suggest further discussion. So that's on the agenda for the 19th as well. And
Yeah,
for today,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So there was this discussion about perhaps unifying. So I think you missed the multi-cluster meeting yesterday, Maru, if I remember correctly. So the Google guys have a draft API for federated ingress, which they kind of developed independently of any of our stuff. But they, I think, were pleasantly surprised that there was a lot of duplication, and so there's a meeting planned for the next few weeks. I think possibly at KubeCon to just figure out if we can unify the API so we don't end up with, you know, two federation, or at least for federated ingress, two different APIs that are essentially the same but tactically different.
so would that be something that sits above an ingress resource? Because I mean, the form of federated resources in Federation v2 is uniform, and that's not to preclude something higher level writing to that, like the whole idea of the primitives. So does the Google effort sit above the primitives, or does it replace it?
It's basically like federated ingress v1 and federated ingress v2. So it sits at that level. And they haven't actually implemented it yet. They've just proposed an API, which looks very similar to our current federated ingress. And I proposed that we at least find out what the delta between the two proposals, or, you know, our implemented one and their proposed one, and figure out whether it makes sense to rather unify them and have a single API, either by adding to, I think there are some shortcomings, and Irfan, I think, or rather Shashi, you missed the meeting as well yesterday, but we needed some more detail from you that we didn't have at the time. I think there are one or two key features that they need and want based on their customer feedback, but they're fairly minor, and it seemed like they could very easily be added to the ingress we currently have, and then they could either implement their own controllers or they could use the ones we already have, and we didn't really discuss that much. But at least try and unify the API so we don't have to teach users that there are these two different federated ingress APIs that do the same thing but look different.
Yeah, I mean, what they have looks largely similar. One catch is going to be that we don't define our primitives in code, and they do. So the form might be similar, but like sharing types is going to be a challenge if, you know.
I don't quite understand what you mean by define them in code.
So if we're going to be having the same API, to me that sort of suggests having a common API definition that we would both consume. Kind of like, you know, the Cube API is defined and we consume the, you know, Kates.io API repo to get all those API definitions. Whereas the way Federation v2 works as of a couple of weeks ago is we don't actually define any primitives in code. They are all generated at deploy time.
But that's implementation detail. I don't think users really care about that. Users care about what API do they need to use, and so that's the focus is unifying that. How whether that gets auto generated or manually written or anything else is you know, step two.
Except we've already implemented and they're just thinking about implementing it.
Exactly, and that was my point that I raised yesterday is, you know, why are you implementing a new thing when we already have an implementation that essentially does just about everything you want, and they were amenable to that line of thinking and agreed to have a discussion to figure out what would need to be added to what we already have to fulfill the API requirements. I mean, they may have other operational requirements that have not yet been expressed. You know, it's Google only, and it is going to have to obviously, I assume, run in GKE and Google Cloud, and you know, maybe they don't like our architecture under the hood or something. I'm just making up stuff now, but I think that's a follow-on discussion. The primary discussion is, can we at least unify the API so that users see the same federated ingress surface area?
Well, it's an interesting topic of discussion anyway.
Yeah.
I'd like to participate in the discussion if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Irfan's scheduling it, so he's the right person to reach out to. But yeah, if I don't see you on the invite, I will add you.
Okay, thank you. Doesn't appear that Irfan's going to be coming today, or?
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, I think he missed. I don't know.
Okay. I guess I'll coordinate with him offline. The supporting work for what he was intending to, or he talked to me about doing before KubeCon, which was the federating of resources via KubeFed. Generic overrides and selector-based placement are both up as PRs, and provided we get review bandwidth, could be merged by KubeCon. It's probably a fairly substantive UI change, but hopefully for the better in both cases.
Yeah, I have gone through both, and I think it looks cool. I think mergeable right now without much change, I believe.
Okay, and I'm happy for feedback.
Sure. Yeah, that's what I was
comment. Okay, cool.
So sorry, I got distracted for a moment. What exactly were the UI changes? Sorry, I missed that.
So the first change is generic overrides. And this isn't full on like JSON path, but it just means that there's no requirement to specify the paths you override in the type config, and any path can be overridden. And this will ensure that every federation deployment is uniform in how overrides work versus allowing users to vary it by deployment, which would be a problem for supportability.
Okay, makes sense.
And the other one was the addition of selector-based placement. It doesn't replace the name-based placement we've been using thus far, because that is supportive of scheduling, making definitive choices, but it does allow for users to specify selectors to kind of in the way that Federation v1 did. Okay,
cool.
And that will also allow, so Irfan's work around federating resources. The discussions I've had with him revealed that when you're federating a resource, you're taking an existing cube resource and saying, I want a federated equivalent. Having to explicitly define placement was problematic. So with selector-based placement, that means you can just set an empty selector, which will select all clusters, which is maybe a nice default.
Yeah, same as V1. Yeah, sounds great.
I'm not actually sure how far along he is. I know he has a lot of other things on his plate before KubeCon, but so my task for next few days, and I'm actually off for 10 days. I'm not going to be attending KubeCon, but I'll be trying to backfill some of the documentation for the changes that emerged in the past month. So that hopefully when people come to Federation V2 after you guys give fantastic presentations at the SIG working groups or otherwise, they'll have something that's a little bit friendlier, or at least up to date with documentation.
Very cool. So just to be clear, will you be back in 2 weeks' time if we wanted to have that meeting? I wouldn't want to do it while you're on vacation.
I'll be gone from the 7th to the 16th, so I'll be back by the 19th.
Oh, okay, great.
So is there any other points of coordination pre-KubeCon people want to discuss?
Yeah, I think there are none. as of now.
Okay. Do people want to discuss the Federation API UX stuff, or do we want to leave that for
I think, yeah, that can
Irfan and
wait.
Paul being absent? Yeah. Okay.
Well, if we got the time now, I mean, there's no time like the present. We can at least start the discussion and then continue it. Yeah, I don't have any objection to doing it now. We had an hour scheduled anyway, I think.
Okay. I mean, as long as we document the substantive points of contention.
Sure.
Paul and Irfan who are absent. So I should say, like, I was the one that raised this in the meeting, but I'm by no means the only one who's, I think, asked for it in various forms.
Mm-hmm.
And the rationale, like on the pro side, having these resources or having the different parts of a federated type, because I think that regardless of how they're represented as resources, we need a template that represents the general form of a resource, the placement that decides which clusters it needs to be put in, and the overrides that define per cluster variation, and status as well. I shouldn't forget that. When status was being implemented, Shashi's initial approach was to actually put it on the template resources, and I pushed back because at the time I wasn't very creative in thinking how that would be possible given the versioning scheme we had. So those four things, whether they exist in a single resource or in different resources, that's the decision, not like what are the components. It's just how do we actually represent the components.
Yeah.
And I think that the initial discussion that we had, earlier this year around why we should keep them separate was centered around modularity and allowing pieces to be replaced and defined separately and evolved separately. And when we were talking architecture, I think that made a lot of sense. And even if I think it was a useful effort to have them completely distinct resources for as long as we have, just to sort of center, at least in my mind, that these are the important pieces. Rather than just being a tiny part of a larger overall whole, they sort of had an outsized importance, like when they were represented as separate resources. But as I've been reworking a lot of the infrastructure over the last couple of months, I've come to realize that the technical reasons why unification was problematic, like the one that stopped status from being included in the template, can be overcome without too much trouble. And I filed issues to represent those potential changes. And that the idea that we need to keep them separate for modularity, the idea that we want to allow sort of flexibility, so someone could say, define their own way of doing placement or define their own way of doing overrides. I'm not sure how that's actually I'm not sure how powerful an argument that is anymore, given how the controllers are constructed. And my emphasis has shifted from allowing flexibility at the resource level to providing useful functionality that could be recomposed if a user wanted to into a different way of doing things. And by this, I mean, the sync controller expects a certain form of template resource and a certain form of override resource and a certain form of placement resource. And if a user wanted to vary that form, they really would have to fork the controller and create it themselves. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. If someone wanted to go off and experiment with, a different form of these primary primitive resources, they could take our code and do it without too much trouble. And if they learn things that suggested changing, the main implementation, that would be great. But the idea that you could take Federation repo, change how placements or overrides or status worked, and reuse the existing controllers, that's essentially a non-starter at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think it's unfortunate what you just said, because I think the original doc that I wrote sort of had a very explicit set of intermediate forms, and basically there was essentially a pipeline where you create the stuff at the beginning of the pipeline. Somebody can, and then a controller can pick it up and generate the next thing in the pipeline and the next thing, and then the following controller picks it up and propagates it to a cluster, for example. And the whole idea behind that was that you could replace any pieces of that pipeline. So, for example, a human could create something halfway down the pipeline, like what would be the right term, like an overridden template, for example, or some external controller could generate that thing from whatever, GitHub or anything else. And then the rest of the, all the rest of the controllers would be oblivious and carry on doing their thing. So I think that's a useful model. If we didn't end up getting there, if we ended up kind of essentially building something that's fairly monolithic anyway, and you can't replace any of those pieces in the pipeline, then I think that's unfortunate. And I think it may be an argument for fixing that problem. I'll tell you what my two concerns are. One is there was another reason for decoupling the various pieces: templates, placements, override status. There were actually other things in the original design which I don't think were ever implemented. And that was around limitations in our permissioning system, and also being able to figure out who specified what. So a canonical example is in Kubernetes, where it's not clear whether the user asked to have a pod on a given node, or whether the user didn't specify that, specified some other constraint somewhere, and then a scheduler decided to put it on that node. And after the fact, when you're looking at the pod, you don't know whether you can move that pod to another node, or reschedule it or whatever, or whether the user actually requested that it be put on that node, in which case putting it on the node is not really an option. So those were some of the background. The second observation, or another observation, is that these primitives were not really designed to be used by end users. They were designed to be used by higher level controllers that could generate them to make their lives easier. So, and that's what we've done, I guess, with the high level services and deployments and whatever else. So from that point of view, I'm not sure what we buy by mashing them all back together again. We don't seem to buy improved user experience, because we provide the user experience with the higher level objects, and we lose permissions and some other flexibility. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to try to go through all of your concerns, because I don't think there's any blocker, but I want to maybe see if I can convince you of that. Mm-hmm. So on the idea of pipeline, I think that my view at least has evolved to you have a federated type, and it's kind of logical today, and it consists of template placement, override, status, resources. But essentially, a federated type is a federated type, and it's all the details that we need to be able to reliably propagate to member clusters. That's why all those things exist. There's nothing precluding there being layers above that boil down to this fundamental logical concept. And so to me, like, the idea of pipelining, we don't preclude it. We don't necessarily need it for what we're doing, because if we're going to propagate, we need all these details. And who provides them? We don't care. It's declarative. Anybody who can write to the Kube API, whether a person or a controller. that's where the data comes from isn't the important thing. But I think over the past year, certainly my experience has been that the logical form that we have is it's useful. And breaking it apart into constituent pieces doesn't, like removing the placement and doesn't allow you to, put resources into clusters with any degree of specificity. Removing the overrides doesn't allow you to, provide per cluster variation. There's different ways to implement it for sure, but I mean, what's there now is like the product of a year of hard work and experience by everybody that's contributed. So granted, we certainly could use user feedback, but anyway, I guess my TLDR on the pipeline concern you have is that what we really define as sort of the end point of the pipeline. What, anybody can layer things ahead of it, but I don't know that having more flexibility in the endpoint is really useful at this point. Does that make sense?
I think we might be talking past each other, and I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be useful to go back to that original diagram, just so that we both have the same image in our head about what I mean about a composable pipeline. And I can totally believe right now, I mean, as you point out, I think our propagator, it needs the template and the placement and the override, and it needs them all in specific forms. And so it's dependent on everything, and it won't work if you change any of those things. I think that might well be true in the current implementation, but that wasn't the original proposal. And I'm not criticizing what we've got. I'm just saying I don't think we should necessarily throw away the concept because we implemented it in a way that didn't achieve the goals of the original concept. I think that one option would be to do that, throw away the concept because we implemented it differently. But another alternative would be to realize that concept. And maybe we can, let me see if I can find that document and project it. Does anyone have it?
My understanding of that original conception was that we would be storing the form of resources that should appear in target clusters in the host API.
That was part of the design,
yeah.
Yes. So,
and
so
I think that was started very early. Like that is, yeah. That involves
it was
more
specifically,
API legwork.
Well, no, not really. I mean, it was specifically designed to address exactly this concern that you just mentioned, which is that you can't currently change any of the pieces because the propagator will break. Whereas in the original design, as long as the propagator has a Kubernetes resource to propagate to a cluster, however it got that, it works. And then ahead of that, you can have, template substitutors and placement and schedulers and whatever else, other pieces. Yeah, I think that, just which page of the document are you on? Is this the first, if you could?
You can see the diagram.
That looks like the one I'm talking about, yeah. So those 5, 6 little stack things, those are the intermediate objects that I'm referring to. So placement preferences, placement decisions, template substitution preferences, substitution outputs, propagation config, etc. And what that gives you is the ability to, compose those things in different ways. And you could, totally replace the placement preferences, the placement decisions, the templating mechanism and everything, and propagation would still work. And you could completely replace cluster placement with some other controller and some other inputs. And as long as it generated, the appropriate templating outputs, the rest of the pipeline would work.
So we have the essentially we have a normalized form of the inputs to propagation. So we're not presupposing that these decisions are made by anyone in particular. So what I'm suggesting is that we have a form of this, but that we're defining what the propagate needs to be fed with, because that's kind of, I mean, whether we use something that's looks like a cube object, or it looks like our current logical federated type, I mean, it's just a different form of the same thing. We could as well explode a logical federated type into individual cube resources intended for member clusters. And in fact, we do that at runtime. But the idea that we needed to actually account for those at runtime and write them to the API was something that we decided not to do. Not saying that someone couldn't decide to do that and write a different propagator driven directly by, you know, a resource that was intended to appear in one of the member clusters. That's not how it's implemented today, and I'm not sure there's good grounds for changing that in the near term. So, I mean, effectively, if you want to be able to, you know, have a pipelining mechanism that made, I mean, we have schedulers today that will make cluster placement decisions and will make override decisions. The RSP scheduler that Irfan wrote is an example of that. And it makes those decisions, and then it just writes them into the right place in the logical federated type, whether it be placement or override. So we have something with the characteristics of what you're describing. It's just implemented in a different way. Because it's fundamentally,
but the outcome of that is that you can't change any of those API types without breaking.
Why? What's the point? The question though is, why do you need to? The whole exercise of the past year was, when we talk about primitives and fundamentals, or at least when I talk about that, this is what we have found is required to drive the system, based on the experience of, you know, actually implementing it, using the system over the past year. So it's not a matter of just, I have an architectural.
Sorry, I have to just give me 1 second, Maru.
Sure. I guess well, Quentin's indisposed. I'd encourage everybody on the call who has a vested interest in federation chiming in. I mean, I hope I'm back. Not the only person with an opinion.
Sorry, I missed the last piece. I had to step away for a few seconds.
I was just encouraging other people on the call who have been involved to chime in with their perspective.
I think you both have a valid concerns. I think some of the points Quentin raised, like the who is doing which changes, mainly the permission related stuff, like whether he's an administrator or a developer. I think that's a valid thing. Like we need to be able to distinguish who is the actor and who is acting on those objects. So I think if you can, I think from a developer perspective, single API type is the, I think makes a lot of sense. It isn't too much of complexity to maintain a lot of types. That's given. So only advantage I can think of is the complexity of a developer. If we divide into a lot of objects, but I'm not getting other benefits except like it will be in one API type.
I mean, I think there's a fairly significant benefit for the user. Today, I have to explain to a user what the different parts of a logical federated resource are. And we have 4 today: template placement, override status. And if I wanted to know what's going on with my resource, why wasn't it put into a cluster, where do I find that information out? And when we discussed this internally at Red Hat. We've been sort of looking at it from a user perspective and going, well, okay, I create my resource and then there's a problem. You know, where is the problem? And it was driven initially from trying to federate a CRD, and then, you know, somebody who didn't have a huge amount of experience running into trouble with the CRD not actually existing in the underlying clusters. And then we had the idea of putting status on the federated type config, indicating whether it was possible to federate two member clusters for a given type. And then it was like, well, how would we troubleshoot other problems? Like if I'm trying to, because sometimes you'd be able to detect when you instantiate a controller that member clusters would not be able to be propagated to. But sometimes those problems wouldn't actually be detectable until we tried to propagate a resource. And how would you discover that? And logging is certainly one answer, but I don't think it's the only answer. So the idea of having status separate, like as much as I was, you know, I pushed you, Shashi, to separate it into a separate controller and a separate resource for technical reasons. When I was considering how someone would be troubleshooting problems with propagation, it was like, oh, that's kind of ugly. I have to know, you know, my federated, I have to really internalize what a logical federated type is. And I have to understand that probably the place I have to go look is a status resource, if status collection is even enabled, which seems kind of problematic from the perspective of diagnosing problems that are inevitably going to occur. So from my perspective, putting everything in one place means that it's a one-stop shop for the user. If they want to change something about a federated type, it's in one place. They want to discover if there's a problem with propagation, it can be in one place. The permission issue, which that's definitely something I don't want to ignore. The challenge of merging the types is we no longer can easily just apply RBAC permissioning. So the placement would be determined, you know, with separate permissions from override or template. I think that's something we can work around if and when it becomes, you know, a requirement with webhook authentication. So I don't think we're not precluding that possibility by merging the resources. And similarly with auditing, I mean, there's any number of webhook options for intercepting requests and performing secondary operations like auditing, like permissioning. So I don't think we're precluding that. It's just that we don't have definitive use cases for that. So I'm not sure, like, deciding to avoid simplifying things for the user. I don't think we have good use cases to push back against the simplification at this time. I mean, if people want to develop those, I'm more than happy.
Let me just be clear, Maru. I am a very strong proponent of simplifying things for the user, and I think we should absolutely do that. And I think having a single resource at the high level, like a single federated replica set or deployment, is perfectly fine. And I would be supportive of us taking our higher level federated deployment and making it a small, simple, single API object. I have no problem with that, to be clear. But I do think that there's value in having lower level primitives that are reusable easily by anybody, for all the reasons we mentioned before. I'll be perfectly candid. I have another which is actually driving a lot of this stuff, which is, you know, we started with a consolidated API. We then, you know, several years ago now, I can't remember, 3-4 years ago, Federation V1, and then we decided to stop work on that, re-architect the whole thing, break it up into pieces, etc. Then we didn't actually realize the goals of that exercise because we ended up with the implementation we have now. Almost, I guess, close to 4 years, 4 years since we started, we're now changing back again to something that looks remarkably similar to V1. Or this is the proposal, essentially. In the meantime, people like Crossplane have gone and implemented all of this stuff and a whole bunch more. And so I think we have a very real risk here that the world leaves us behind. And because we're so busy noodling and re-noodling, we still have alpha APIs across the board after 3.5 years. We just can't afford to, go backwards and forwards any more times than we already have. I don't see a lot of benefit in going back, to be honest. But in addition to that, I think we actually just need to go forwards now.
We are going forwards, Quentin. The whole point of this is we're evolving. This, to my mind, this is like, yes, we're coming full circle, but to suggest that we're sitting on our hands or we haven't made a lot of progress.
No, to be clear, I'm not suggesting people have not been working. Please don't misinterpret. I'm not saying
No.
Working.
That wasn't what I was hearing. It's more that
lots of work has gone into this, and I really acknowledge that, and I really appreciate that. And please don't misinterpret.
The difference here is that we're the underpinnings here are extremely flexible, and we can federate anything. Mm-hmm. And we can do it without writing code. And so to me, this is just kind of like cleaning it up and putting it in a position where, yes, we can go GA. We have all the pieces, we have all the functionality, and we're presenting it as simple a form as possible. So to my mind, this is kind of the end point. Everything else that's come before has enabled this. Prior to a lot of the work that's been going in the past few months, it was really difficult to evolve the form of the logical federated type. Now we're generating them in such a way that evolution is actually really easy. Like I've implemented generic overrides and selector-based placement in a matter of a couple days. And previous to a lot of the underpinnings, like the underlying changes, that would have been like weeks of work. So
I agree.
In my mind, this is like, right, I guess my point is simply that we've gotten to the point where evolution of a federated type in terms of changing the API is actually super easy. And if we get user feedback, we can respond to it like really quickly versus having to laboriously spend months doing stuff. So my way of thinking is simply like, if we can get unified, if we can clean up the UX prior to beta and GA, I want to do it then. Like to my mind, this is sort of the last period of time where I could reasonably hope to make this change and not impact enough people that it would be a huge problem. And as you say, it would be like, oh God, there's churn. But at this point, like we're really nascent. We haven't really gotten a lot of mind share. It's starting to grow, but yeah, to my mind, it's kind of now or never. For some of the reasons you're saying we shouldn't make it, I'm saying we really should. We should do it now because we can't, I wouldn't anticipate being able to do it going forward. I want a better user experience. That's my motivation is, it makes things a little bit simpler on the development side, but really it's about, if I'm explaining federation to an end user, if I'm trying to justify why things are the way they are, the current way of doing things feels kind of kludgy.
I totally agree, and I've said before, I'm fully supportive of a high-level, easy-to-use API types like federated deployment, single object that has all the stuff in it that you need to tell it about your deployment, and which works. I don't think there's any contention around that. The only question is that thing implemented as the lowest level in federation, or is that built on top of the primitives, which I would like ideally to see to be closer to the primitives that were in the doc you had projected a moment ago, for the reasons that they provide the decoupling.
What the
But-
coupling? Sorry,
So
can you,
it sounds like your proposal, I think, is more to take the primitives and bundle them all together
correct.
and have users use those primitives rather than use the higher level types.
I mean, I'm not precluding the higher level stuff at all. This isn't a suggestion that we need to just focus on this unified resource as the only touch point for federation. It's mainly that I want to unify the primitives into one resource so that anybody who's using it at that level has a good experience. But I mean, if you've read the cross-plane document, they mentioned federation and the possibility of maybe leveraging it. And so the idea that it would maybe be something that, you know, I think anybody who is sitting on top of it would be happier with a single resource anyway. But yeah, anyway.
How receptive?
Go ahead.
How receptive would folks be to leave the primitives in place as we have them today and create a new resource type like workload to correlate to the cross-plane stuff, or federated whatever that is constructed with the primitives in it, and you don't really work with the lower level primitives, you just work with this as the implementation for the push reconciler to work with just this sort of combined resource and leave it as like a push reconciler implementation detail.
Sorry, I missed didn't quite follow the last part of your statement. The first 2/3 of your statement, I fully support. That's exactly what I'm proposing. The
Yeah,
last
it
part,
sounds.
I don't understand.
It sounds to me like perhaps having a new resource that is constructed of the existing primitives is something that would simplify the push reconciler, as it would only need to work with one resource, and it makes a lot of the details that have been brought up in the meeting more doable and easier to work with, on top of making the user experience more streamlined. If that's the case, and the existing primitives stay intact, there could potentially be a way to have it be leveraged for other reconciling mechanisms. Perhaps Crossplane would want to leverage those primitives in some different way. Perhaps there is value in keeping those primitives, but moving away from having the user to define them explicitly and just provide them sort of like a new workload API type as the interface for them to federate their application or resource.
Yeah, I mean, what you're proposing is exactly what I was proposing, and so big +1. Regarding Crossplane, I don't want to speak on behalf of Crossplane, and they'll actually be here in 2 weeks' time. But I can't see them using federation. They built their own stuff because they couldn't wait for us any longer, and so I wouldn't.
Kind of a funny statement, given that I haven't seen them participate in the community at all. They wanted to genuinely use it. Usually, engagement is the first step.
Yeah, you can ask them. You can ask them in a couple of weeks' time. So we don't have any Crossplane people here right now, do we? If we do, then they can talk to that question directly. Otherwise, we'll ask them in 2 weeks' time.
So, I mean, it sounds like both Ivan and Quentin, you're suggesting that we retain the existing resources and put a new overarching resource on top of it. And is that what you're suggesting? Am I confused?
Well, it would at least enable the ability for it to be reused, as opposed to combining it. And then if somebody wants to somehow use some facet of the combined resource, then we'd have to split it back out for some potential reason.
But why would, consider what the unified resource would look like. It would be an API type with the same details that are currently present in the individual resources. If someone wanted to reuse that resource and specify the template field, but not placement or override, or specify the placement field, but not template or override, how is that really like a problem. Like the form is the same, it's just in one place. And if you don't want to use any one piece of it, just like if you don't want to define a field in a deployment or a secret, you just don't set a value. But the data structure is the same for the fields you are defining. They would be the individual resources.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And it's potentially possible for the primitives to just move away entirely. If no one ever shows interest in it, we don't have a use for it, we can maybe subsequently remove it entirely. Or we could move that route now and remove them. And if somebody needs them, we can reconstruct them, or they can somehow develop their own new resource based on the existing combined federated resource type. I think if we end up combining them and no longer using the primitives, perhaps there isn't a reason to keep them around.
Is there a use case to keep them around?
I mean, they're essentially the same data, just composed. So I think, you know, if you have one, you don't need the other. If we decide to stick to individual primitive resources versus a unified resource, the data is the same. It's just simpler to have them all together. And the idea, I mean, even if you're talking pipeline requirements, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I need to drop off now, unfortunately. And I think it would also be good to have Irfan in this discussion. So
Yeah,
we're nearly out of time. Maybe we can defer it till, those of you who will be in Seattle, we can talk about this further there. There are a couple of Federation multi-cluster meetups and presentations and things. So there'll be a forum there if anyone wants to talk about it. And then we can continue in 2 weeks' time at this meeting. I mean, you guys are welcome to carry on now, but I need to drop off.
Hey, Quentin, really quick, all the meetups and so forth that you're referencing for KubeCon, that's all on the standard schedule?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
There's an intro session for newcomers to this SIG, and there's a deep dive session as well, and some demos. All right, bye guys.
Sure. I think, yeah, it's almost time. We shall continue our discussion maybe in the next meeting. I think we can think more about it, right?
I guess one last point on that is maybe it makes sense either in the agenda or some document that just talks about the two approaches. It seems like that's really what the discussion is introducing a new overarching type, or kind of bundling all three of the existing primitives into a new type, right? And it just may make sense to document those two approaches and just start listing the pros and cons. And I think, or at least from a couple weeks ago, it sounds like CERN is a use case that is important to the project. And it'd be nice to maybe get their input on which direction, or if they don't care either way, then at least we know that they've had a chance to voice their opinion.
Yep, right.
What, can someone sort of highlight the cons?
Sure, I think
one resource versus multiple resources. Like if I was approaching this from the perspective of someone who's never seen Federation, why would I choose to have the resources broken apart?
Yeah, and from my standpoint, Maru, I see where you're coming from. And if there's really no one using the primitives today, or they're using them just in like a lab environment, kicking the tires, great. Now, if someone is using them and we're saying, okay, we're going to make these big changes, then I know that will be a little bit of heartache for them, but I guess it's also expected since it's alpha.
I think that's definitely my thinking. I mean, if I was to summarize my argument sort of I think I would say that it's just a simpler experience. And if we make the change now before we get a user base and before we go beta, then the pain is minimal. So it seems like a win for me.
Yeah. But now if we flip it the other way and we say, well, introducing, let's call it federated deployment, right? That kind of wraps all 3 or 4 of the existing primitives. And we introduce that because that solves a problem of the user experience. And then we at least give that time to mature, and we find out that, you know what, no one's really using the lower layer primitives, and let's just use federated deployment as the single primitive or the single overarching type. Kind of allows a migration approach. What are your thoughts with that?
Another point here is like we need to really evolve this higher level API to be something close to like a multi-cluster app. It is not just federating. Maybe we need to include some concepts like how they propagated, maybe in what order, maybe a true user case from a multi-cluster application scenario.
But that's a higher level thing that really doesn't touch on this.
Right. Yeah,
And
that's a given. Like maybe we need to think in the future. Yeah, that doesn't add to this particular argument, but it's a side track. Yeah.
Yeah. So beyond, let's call it again, federated deployment, Shashi.
define resources,
Yeah.
right? We're talking about applications, which is something we've touched on. We've thought about maybe using like the application CRD that SIG Apps has been working on. Seems like, you know, Crossplane has their own sort of ideas about what an application is. But I really want to underscore that what we're doing is still low level. Like the fact there'll be one type, it'll simplify it for some users. But the idea of scheduling individual resources has never made a huge amount of sense to me. Like scheduling a replica set or deployment, what does that mean? How many applications consist of only a replica set or only a deployment? Like it makes sense for batch workloads, maybe, like a job and, you know, moving that around. But most applications have, you know, different services and databases, and, you know, configuration, the form config maps or secrets. And if we're not scheduling that entire set of resources into a cluster and rescheduling it all into another cluster, then we're not really being that helpful in my mind. And the primitive stuff and the sync controller, that's low level. That's designed to, you know, if I had a high level app definition, I could generate the logical federated types and then make sure, that would make sure that the resources individually go to where they need to go. Like the way Cube is architected suggests that we want this, you know, type-based sync controller, but that's not sufficient for something to be really useful, I don't think. So anyway, I think that's me violently agreeing in way too many words. And to me, like, I think we're converging on something where the lower level stuff is basically done. That's where I want to be. I want to be like the sync controller and like federated types. That's a given. That's like just air. And then the community can focus on actually building things on top of it that are genuinely useful. Irfan.
Oh yeah, look at that.
Maybe.
Hi folks. Hi guys.
Hey,
an hour late intentionally.
Am I?
Yeah, we met an hour ago, and we were wondering where you went.
Well, it's still good timing. Still got a good discussion going on. Maru, can I just go back to that question that I posed to you? Is if with the approach of introducing the kind of a higher level resource, and then if the lower level primitives are not being used in the future, and just kind of eliminating them, so kind of a migration strategy as opposed to you know, an all-out replacement at this point. What's your feedback on that? I mean, what are your concerns with taking more that approach?
To me, having to maintain 2 separate code paths, given the size of our development community, is problematic. We could do it, but I kind of view this as we're making, the last breaking change. Like most of the changes up till now have just been like iterative, like stuff like adding, generic placement. That's okay. Or sorry, selector-based placement or generic overrides. Like that's more additive. This is a fundamentally breaking change because people have been using federation with the separated primitives. They're going to have to change how they do it. But really, it's just copy, paste. Like take the fields you used to have in your placement resource, pull it into a unit. I mean, I guess my suggestion would be we could probably create a capability within KubeFed temporarily, like not for long-term maintenance, that would take the individual resources and merge them. And we could maybe gauge interest, but I guess for me, it's use case driven. Do we have people who are genuinely committed to the existing broken apart federated type scheme? And if so, we can find ways to transition them to this new way of doing things. And if not, then we can just transition. But yeah, my assumption is we don't have anybody using this in production that isn't resourced well enough to deal with the change. And if they are, I mean, I would hope they would speak up in these meetings. If they're using it in production and they're not engaged in the community, they're really setting themselves up for failure.
Yeah.
At least pre-beta and pre-GA. It's just, it's really hard to use something that's evolving underneath you unless you have a stake and the conversation with the people evolving it.
Yeah, because the way I see it is both approaches are solve the problem with UX, whereas the approach of introducing the overarching resource, as you mentioned, it just we're dragging along or introducing more work, more maintenance work. Whereas the sweeping wholesale change could introduce user pain, but if we don't really have any users that are speaking up or any use cases that would be against that, then I would agree that just making the wholesale change is a better approach.
Yeah. So I don't know.
So, I'm sorry. So I guess just to reiterate the point is, unless there's someone else out there, I think CERN is really the one piece of input that I would like to hear from. And if they don't really care, then
I think, but in case of CERN, I think it only partially helps. The rebalancing would still not work out. Only in the initial case, maybe we can just distribute the jobs. That's it. Rebalancing would still not work later if some jobs are not able to execute for completion. We couldn't rebalance into another cluster because of immutable fields, right?
I mean, their challenges are more related to scheduling, like not propagation. They need advanced capability in how they decide where.
Yeah, with the current Kube API, the scheduling may not work. Like like initial way of distributing, and then later rebalancing may not work.
Right, and not just that's kind of more of a clash between how jobs is implemented and like it's not really designed to be scheduled above, like there's a job scheduler, there's not really support for higher order schedulers in its design.
Yep.
So, go ahead, sorry.
My initial suggestion on how folks would be receptive to that idea is just more focused around kind of developing a compromise. I think it is simpler for the push reconciler to work with one consolidated resource, and there's no need to necessarily, unless other users, as the points were brought up, unless other users are still using the primitives and would not welcome a breaking change like this, we don't necessarily have to support using primitives any longer and can move to one resource. And if there is some sort of hesitance around just removing the primitives entirely, then maybe those can be moved to beta and call it good, and those can be published to a separate API repo, but potentially for no one to even use. So there may not be value in doing that. And so, but if there is that hesitance, maybe that is a compromise that we can do, and we don't have to support the primitives any longer. We can work with the one resource, but those primitives can exist in beta form and can continue to evolve if there's other projects that are interested in using it.
Just, I mean, to me, it seems a little bit hand wavy that like someone would want to use the separate resource primitives, but not a unified resource. Like it's kind of, it's speculative, and I'm like, well, who's using it? Do we actually have a use case that says we need to keep these separate?
Yeah, I think we might also need to consider something like a pull-based reconcilers, like whatever
Sure.
we are building should be modular enough to allow all such schemes.
And it will. I mean, like I said, like the form, how am I'm having trouble sort of providing a good way of conceptualizing this, but like the data that we're using doesn't change. Like we still need, you know, template placement override. Those still exist as concepts, but instead of being separate resources, they're just fields in one resource. So to me, it's like there's no use cases I can think of where having those in separate resources versus one resource provides us, you know, any benefit. Like I shouldn't say that. The only one that I can think of is the permissioning. And in the past, that's been one of my justifications for keeping things separate, is we maybe want to have separate RBAC permissions on placement and override, maybe for the purposes of applying policy decisions. But I don't think, like, the fact that we can't use RBAC directly, we can always do webhook validation to provide differential permissions at field level. So to my mind, that's the out. Like the primary reason that I was saying things needed to be separate, like beyond anything else, was I want to be able to apply different, you know, authorization requirements on the different parts of a logical federated type. And to me, whether or not this is a good idea really just hinges on, do people believe that, you know, permissioning can be accomplished with webhook or not? If it can, then that, to me, that's a blocker. But that's the only technical reason why this shouldn't happen. Everything else that I've heard seems largely theoretical. And that's not to say I'm dismissing it. I'm just, if I had use cases that were like, we really need to keep them separate for this reason, for this reason, for this reason. You know, we have users that want to do this, and that really requires that they be structured in this way. They're separate resources. That to me would be really good rationale, and I wouldn't be like, we have to do it anyway. I just haven't heard any compelling reasons yet. And so in the intervening time between now and the 19th, I would encourage everyone to find justification if indeed you have an interest in keeping things as separate resources. Because I'd like to be convinced. I don't want to feel like I'm trying to impose something stupid on, or, you know, unreasonable on everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
too argumentative about this, but I guess I've thought a lot about it in my head, and it's good to finally bring it out into the open, and hopefully we can find consensus over the coming weeks.
Yeah.
And from a user standpoint, with the stuff I did with federated STO, you know, I opened up an issue around creating some kind of tool that could, you know, generate or, you know, take a standard resource and as input and spit out the federated equivalent. And so if we go back to, you know, the problem that's trying to be solved of let's improve the user experience, from going through that process, whether the tools spit out, you know, a manifest that has these lower level primitives, or whether it spits out one that has a single resource, I think I care less about than actually having something that just really improves my experience. And that is making it easy for users that have all these manifests that are unfederated. And if we want to improve the user experience, have something that makes it very easy to federate, and whether that federated manifest has all these different primitives or a single one, to me, is less, solves a problem less than just having something that we can take the input and spit out the federated version of that manifest.
Yeah, I think we all do agree about that one point at least. Like there should be an API which consolidates all these things, but whether the primitive should be along with it, that's quite a contention actually. Yeah, I think depending on the usage, maybe we can remove it. Yeah, either way, I think yeah, it should be fine. I think we should go ahead with a consolidated type representing all of this. Yep.
Yeah. Let me apologize first. I think I did miss a whole 1 hour of fruitful discussion, and that was because my mind clock somehow moved the daylight saving only for this week because I attended yesterday's Sig multi-cluster sync at 11. So somehow I thought that this is moved an hour ago. So one question is, was Quentin there on this call earlier?
He was, yeah. So we're scheduled to talk about this on the 19th. So this isn't the end of the discussion. We're not coming to a conclusion. This is just an initial conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I
One of the main reasons, well, you were saying something? Please go ahead.
Sorry, I have to run. I just wanted to respond to Dane's comment.
Okay.
I think that the initial federation of something, and as you say, it's generated, it doesn't matter. I think the main reason I think unifying is useful is more for operational. Like if I want to go in and edit a resource, I don't want to have a bunch of different pieces. I just want to have it in one place, and I want the status to be there too.
Yeah, and I agree. And let me just kind of rephrase or reiterate that I don't necessarily think that it's not useful. I just think
Sorry, I have to go.
Okay.
My apologies.
Yeah, no worries.
We'll talk again.
Okay.
Sure, I think
yeah, we should wind up.
We'll continue this discussion on 19th as far as I. And I didn't see any update on the notes. So is there...
Yeah, I'll update that. Yep.
Okay, please. Great, thanks a lot.
Sure.
So
okay, see you folks.
We'll see you guys on 19th then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, thanks.